Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dee Dee Petri, President and CEO of the National Association for Olmsted Parks, the managing partner of the Olmsted 200 campaign. We hope that you are enjoying the summer of Olmsted and taking advantage of the wide range of wonderful activities from coast to coast. We are grateful to communities across America and hundreds of celebration partners who are helping us explore the enduring legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted. Please visit olmsted200.org to learn more and to watch our ever-changing calendar and blog. In just a few weeks, September 9, we'll be hosting a symposium with our partner, the Architect of the Capitol, exploring the Olmsted's conservation legacy. Watch your inbox and plan to register for this program on Capitol Hill soon. It will include a range of terrific speakers, including Rolf Diamant, co-author of Olmsted in Yosemite, Sam Hodder, president of Save the Redwoods League, Shelton Johnson, interpretive ranger at Yosemite National Park, and Philip Burnham, author of Indian Country, God's Country, Native Americans, and National Parks. After the symposium concludes, we will be offering special tours of the Capitol grounds and planting a tree in honor of Olmsted for his 200th birthday. We are hoping that the National Park Service Director, Chuck Sams, will join us. This morning, I was honored to testify before the Parks Committee of the Milwaukee County Board of Supervisors as it considers a resolution to name the Olmsted Way in Olmsted's Washington Park. There, city leaders are also engaged in an important community-wide conversation about ways to reverse the divisions caused in the 1960s when a freeway was introduced in Washington Park, dividing the Black neighborhood. This is a good reminder that Olmsted 200 is a celebration, but it is also an opportunity to initiate important conversations about the ways the built environment can advance social justice, equity, and sustainability. In so many ways, this is the enduring legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted, who understood that thoughtful design can and must play a role in advancing positive social, cultural, and economic benefits. As we've said before, Olmsted 200 is not about a single day or a single year. It's looking to the future. So we are especially pleased today to explore how a new generation of landscape architects, a term I might add that Olmsted and Vox established, is putting Olmsted's principles into action. We will converse with three individuals named Olmsted Scholars by the Landscape Architecture Foundation, one of Olmsted 200's 10 founding partners. You will hear more about the Olmsted Scholar Program shortly. Moderating our program is a leading landscape architect and principal in the firm of Michael Van Valkenburg Associates, Laura Solano. The American Society of Landscape Architects has just announced that Laura will receive the 2022 Design Medal later this year. The medal recognizes an individual landscape architect who has produced a body of exceptional design work at a sustained level. What a treat for me to be able to be one of the very first to congratulate Laura on this special award. And I might add, to welcome her today after breaking her arm yesterday. We're really glad she's here. It's no wonder that she's receiving this recognition. Her projects include Teardrop Park in Manhattan, Allegheny Riverfront Park in Pittsburgh, Alumni Valley at Wellesley College, Brooklyn Bridge Park, and the George W. Bush Presidential Center in Dallas. Laura was a member of the Soils Committee for the Sustainable Sites Initiative and taught at Harvard's Graduate School of Design for many years. Most importantly, Laura has described herself as a complete Olmsted geek. She will be joined today by Angelique Easley DeLuca, a landscape architect for WSP USA. Angelique uses oral history interviews, mapping, and archival analysis to understand and reflect the full story for design. She aspires to advocate for environmental justice through her work and to create spaces that improve the way people experience and engage with landscapes and history. Bryce Donner is a landscape architect and graduate student at the University of Florida. His practice and academic work focus on researching and building more resilient landscapes in Florida's Spring Heartland, a region with over 1,000 artesian springs. And Coco Alarcon is a Peruvian architect and landscape architect currently pursuing a PhD in global health and implementation science at the University of Washington, a campus, I should note, designed by John Charles Olmsted. His most recent project examines how landscape interventions in the cities of the Amazon rainforest impact health and ecology. Laura will start off the conversation this afternoon, framing our discussion, and then open up a conversation with our panelists. She will also be fielding questions from the audience, so we urge you to put them in the Q&A box. Don't be shy. With that, let me turn this over to Laura. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Dee Dee. I really appreciate everything you said about Olmsted. And now that you've outed me as an Olmsted geek, I think I should explain that just a little bit. You know, over my 40 years as a landscape architect, I've kind of always, of course, looked at his writings and his work. And I think that the thing that I share with him is I think he believes that landscape architects don't make nature, but rather set the circumstances for nature to take hold. And I think that was an ethical stance. I think he was saying that we have an obligation to make spaces that are enduring and durable. In other words, landscapes have to work at all levels. Before we move on, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Olmsted Scholars Program. Some of you may know that it is the premier leadership program to recognize landscape architecture students in the US and Canada. Although the program is named after Olmsted, it doesn't mean that Olmsted scholars are actually scholars of Olmsted. Instead, the program recognizes that these are students with exceptional leadership potential who are using ideas, influence, communication, service, and leadership to advance sustainable design and foster human and societal benefits. Gee, no pressure on them. And the Olmsted Scholars Network is now almost 1,000 strong. It's been around for 15 years. And I'm happy to say that it really stretches across the full range of practice. We've had scholars in the public sector, private sector, academia, and not-for-profit world. And we know that they will contribute to the profession in ways that Olmsted would be proud of. So before we start, I'd like to just give a brief overview of what today's speakers will be talking about, and I'm sure some of the questions as well. And those are that landscapes are interconnected ecological systems, both natural, constructed, and social. Landscape architects and landscapes can't be good at just one level. We need to go across the entire spectrum. Second, that nature operates as a democracy, and it recognizes that the intensity of urban life, that everyone needs to pull away and needs to be restored and can be restored in the context of nature. And last, that Olmsted reviewed landscapes as a public health intervention. Just a reminder before we start with the panelists to submit your questions during the discussion, and we'll do our best to respond by the end of the program. So first, up are our panelists, and we'd like each of them to share with you about a 2 to 3 minute discussion of some information about themselves, but probably more to the point, the research and work that they're engaged in that might embody the principles or key ideas of Olmsted's work. So Angelique, could you give us a chance to hear what you've been up to?
And a lot of my work focuses on the advocacy and connections that are formed with landscapes. A lot of my work focuses on the idea that landscapes are not just touching one form or aspect. A lot of it is searching for the different layers. So what people are interacting with, how people are shaping the landscape, and what can be viewed through the landscape, and what is the legacy over time.
Thank you. And Bryce?
And thank you, Landscape Architecture Foundation and Olmsted 200 for bringing us on to speak about our work. I am a landscape architecture practitioner, educator, graduate student, and architect itself. My work focuses on building and researching landscape architecture projects in the Florida Spring Heartland, a region in North Central Florida that sits on top of our Floridan aquifer. So this involves looking at superficial aspects to the landscape as well as underneath in our of the landscape itself.
Thanks, Bryce. And Coco?
Hi, Lara. Thank you for the question. My background is in architecture, landscape architecture, and public health. My work focuses on the design and research of how the built environment, especially the landscape, impact and benefit human and ecological health, and health in all the dimensions, and the economical aspects, social aspects. So we could say also social development. My current work focuses on how to develop landscape architecture systems in the city of Iquitos, one of the largest cities in the Amazon rainforest in Peru.
Thank you. So our first question, this is for Bryce and Angelique. Today, landscape architects talk about our work from the standpoint of systems, right? There's this theory that, in fact, all landscape elements of wildlife, vegetation, water, humans, we work together to create places. So how do you consider the landscape systems when you design? And let's start with Bryce.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of this work comes in through research and map making, and through understanding the landscape through various lenses. We can look at what has happened over the millennia and where we're going to go in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years through our design intervention. So for one example, with my work at the University of Florida, there is a map, and maybe we can pull it up, and it shows these landscape influences that are on the land itself. So one question I always like to ask is, what would happen is if we did nothing? What are the players on the land, the animals, the plants, the water, and the people themselves, and what is going to happen if we do nothing? Where do people want to go? Where do people want to gather? Where are animals building their homes? And most importantly, or very importantly, what is the water going to do? The water is going to go downhill, it's going to form rivers and ravines, and it's in certain places going to percolate into our aquifer. So once we know what's going to happen if we do nothing, then we can start to do something. And then what are we going to do? That involves public outreach, it involves stakeholder input, and it involves bringing in conversations so that we can make that first step. And that's what we call a system that involves people, wildlife, hydrology, and geology, all working together to create what we call the landscape.
That's so interesting, Bryce. So what you're describing is really about landscape architects stepping back, right? And recognizing that in a way, the client in front of them is the land itself. And it's our responsibility to shepherd that in the best way possible. So tell us a little bit more about your thinking when you approach a piece of land in a project.
Absolutely. I will take us into some gardens that I've built down in Miami, which start with the same concept. What happens if we do nothing? But we're called as professionals, as designers, to do something. So I see this one plot of garden, of a home garden, as not only the home for the people that are living there, but also part of this interconnected home of a ecoregion. And so how does this plot of land, this 1,500 square feet, link into the overall system and can create habitat for all kinds of critters that are linked into the food web and the food chain that eventually creates the infrastructure with which we depend on.
Right, right. Thank you. So Angelique, could you give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, everything that Bryce said is exactly what I do. So I look at the layers of the landscape. So looking from the ground up versus top down. So looking at the different elements that are put together to make a landscape whole. So how people are interacting with spaces, how vegetation is growing, or if it's not growing, and then looking at what could be the factors for these things. So is it people walking and creating cow paths or desire lines, like understanding how people and how wildlife are interacting with these spaces, and then going in and looking at what can, like what Bryce said, taking a step back and what can we do as designers to influence that, and then looking at Olmsted's principles and understanding that it's not always about the scenery, it's about how people shape a landscape and how people interact and produce incredible interactions with nature, and how people are just being in a place versus just walking past or something like that.
Yeah, that sounds so that sounds so right. And yet we all know as landscape architects that it's really tough to get to that outcome. And I think part of Olmsted's genius was his ability to understand the underlayment that engineering played in his work through drainage, surveying, the way that structural components work and contribute to landscapes. So do you also consider those in the work that you do?
Yeah, so what I'm doing currently with my work is understanding the foundations and understanding how, or rather, what needs to be put in a space and how it could be pushed down the line for future designers to, future designers to create it. So I do a lot of foundational work and understanding the systems and understanding the planning aspect of it.
Yeah, I as a landscape architect, I always find it interesting that there's so much hidden in the landscape. And I think as there should be, with moments, of course, to kind of reveal just the natural processes. So I'm curious about how either of you makes the natural processes of landscape reveal themselves in your work. And Angelique, why don't you go first?
That's a great question. I would say sitting back and just seeing how people are interacting with it and how to improve that interaction.
So so in that answer, humans are part of the equation of these systems as well.
Yeah, wildlife too, and seeing how, okay, are there birds circulating in this area? Are they historic birds? Are there birds that aren't native to this area? What's drawing them here?
Right, right. And Bryce?
I take a very broad lens view to nature, and humans are absolutely included in that equation. At this point, whether you're a landscape architect or not, you are a steward of this planet. And what landscape architects have the agency to do is they have specific tools and specific interventions with which we can provide for nature and humanity to live and work together.
Oh, thank you.
Grading and drainage, planting design in a very formalized way, and then after the fact, the way people will actually live and play in a park or garden.
Great. So let's move on and talk about another thing that Olmsted was so brilliant at, which is recognizing and creating democratic spaces where people of all classes, and colors, and creeds could come together and see and be seen. I will say that our profession over the years hasn't been so great at seeing that through. Let's just say we've made some mistakes in not recognizing that a sense of place and connections really need to appeal to the entire community. So how do you see the future of landscape architecture overcoming the mistakes of our past? And how do we amplify the voices of those who have been erased, forgotten, or not heard in our society? Coco, can you take that one?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's a tricky question to address, to answer in every project. I will say there are several tools in the landscape architecture profession that we are trying to push forward. I will say the first one is the participatory design approach. I think that's crucial, key component for any type of intervention. And there is the participatory design process. It's not a recipe. It has to be customized for each project, depending on each context. For example, working with Amazonian communities, sometimes with recent migrants, when you ask questions, when you have the typical workshops, you don't get straight answers. We have learned recently that for them, drawing, it's like an easier process to express ideas, or making lists of items for them. It's like, that's the best way. We have seen examples in the Troy master plan that they have to use so many different tools. They have one-to-one interviews, they have workshops, they have tools or surveys online. So I think that's an excellent tool for amplifying the voice of the communities. I also think that it's important that landscapes designers do their homework in the aspect of reviewing literature, reviewing what's the background, what's the history, what's the cultural, economic, health context where you're working. Not just focus on the dimensions on the side, but the system that surrounds or that is integrated in the landscape. I think with both pieces of information, we can start to design more informed landscapes.
That's so interesting, because what you're talking about is meeting people where they are, right? Whatever their context is, whatever their neighborhood is doing, looks like, feels like, what is the engine really that drives their neighborhoods. And it's the same with landscapes, right? We have to address landscapes where they are, in whatever condition we find them. So I love how you talked about this crossover, that, remember everybody, we're doing this for people and they are part of the system. So that must be rewarding. Have you had some good experiences with that?
Yeah, I think when you address, and especially in the context where we work in rural areas in Peru, when we address and we actually involve people in the participatory process, it's not just rewarding, but also it's like guaranteeing that the project is going to last, So
Yeah.
it has direct impacts on the sustainability of the projects. Right now we are designing like a large scale municipal program for delivering and designing parks and gardens at home. We have found that the crucial components is that the participatory approach at every level, because we don't know what's going to happen with the local governments in 4 or 5 years, but we know when people is involved, gardens are going to still there, and our investment is not going to be lost, and actually people is going to invest. So yeah, we have actually several rewards, not just the personal level, but also the project level.
Yeah. Angelique, I know this topic is of interest to you as well. Can you share what you've been doing?
Yeah, my undergrad and graduate research was focusing on post-enslavement landscapes and post-World War II Jewish landscapes. And a lot of it was having uncomfortable conversations and having conversations about what happened and how can we address it and how can we make sure that we're telling the full story with our research, history, and design. So a lot of it was speaking with people versus at, if that makes sense. Like making sure that you are listening to what they're saying and listening to how people are reacting to you coming in and taking their story for your own personal benefit, which in the long run would help benefit them. So a lot of my research focused on what happened to these landscapes and where are they now? So a lot of the post-World War II Jewish landscapes focused on people acknowledging their history and making sure that it's not forgotten. And what my research focused on here in the United States was the preservation and documentation of a Black cemetery in Tyler, Texas. And a lot of it was seeing who has the right to land, who has the right to tell these stories. And I think with Olmsted, what he did was make sure that there are stories that are told. It could be visual, it could be some sort of like mixture of how people are interacting with spaces. And what I aim to do as a designer is to make sure to tell the full story and get the understanding and understand the different systems put in place and almost breaking them.
Yeah.
That's the best way of saying it. And seeing the patterns. So you see a lot of Black neighborhoods bisected by expressways or by transportation centers or hubs or train tracks even, and understanding what can I do as a designer to rectify that problem and to connect spaces and places together.
Yeah. You know, what's so interesting about what you're saying is that by allowing the true story to emerge and be told, it's a great base for going forward, right? Because you erasing the past by denying the conversation is never going to result in a rich future. And I think that's what we all aim for with our landscapes, right? Is an enriching condition that will allow people to tell their own stories and make their own stories. Okay, so the last question for the scholars, and then we'll take questions that are coming in from the audience. This is for Coco and Bryce. So we know that Olmsted viewed landscapes as a public health intervention, and fortunately or not, we've had a chance to kind of test that that thinking as we've all lived through the pandemic over the last couple of years. So what are some lessons learned from the pandemic, living through and in the pandemic, regarding landscape design and public health? And has it changed the way that you see landscape architects' ability to help make some of those changes in the world? And let's start with Bryce.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. First and foremost, I would like to say that public spaces are critical to public health and well-being. And having an environment, especially in the pandemic, where you can breathe fresh air and be outdoors and have that long-range view, and potentially even interact in a safe social distancing manner with people that you feel connected to, was critical to making it through the pandemic with a healthy body, mind, and soul. Even if it's just walking on the street and that feeling you get of saying hi to somebody you know, that sense of community that gets woven together in public spaces is critical. So this pandemic and This was my first pandemic. I had never done one.
Hopefully your last.
Hopefully the last. This pandemic really peeled back the layers of, how this society gets built, especially in urban contexts where there's so many. So we need fresh water, as Olmsted pointed out, and a healthy sanitation system. But even on the surface, even those lawns and those parks and those playgrounds where people get to express themselves and interact with other people, or be solo, or be in the wilderness and get that energy of recreation or respite. These are public spaces that provide mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. And I've heard recently that your doctor can even prescribe to you a prescription for public parks. You can get a prescription to go spend time outdoors.
Oh, that's fantastic. Certainly a contemporary of Olmsted's, William James, the psychologist, he talked about soft fascinations in nature and how those are moments that you really can't embrace in sort of the everyday, work of our lives. We keep ourselves busy, but those soft fascinations kind of allow your mind to wander. And I think a lot of that was lost during the pandemic because we were all frightened to the level where we kind of stayed indoors. Coco, do you have some thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, I agree with Bryce. The landscapes play always a role on public health. They reduce carbon in the environment, provide spaces for mental health and well-being, for physical activity. If you have urban agriculture, you even can produce a source of food or a source of income. I think during the pandemic, several of these dimensions were amplified and were crucial to deal with the existing crisis. And I want to share a couple of examples. In the slums of Lima in 2011 or 2012, we designed and built community gardens and household gardens in a community with 90 people, 90 households. During the pandemic, the first months of the pandemic, transportation was limited and also access to food to the market. Some markets were empty. People in the community were producing food already in different spaces, but during the pandemic, they increased the production of their gardens and the community gardens. This allowed them to have additional sources of food for themselves, or to exchanging for other goods, for example, fish. So people were able to access to protein during this period. In the case of the communities in Iquitos, we designed and built gazebos that could have a function of a public space, guiding public space, so almost like an informal community center for communities living along the river. And during the pandemic, even before the pandemic, because they also had an earthquake and some classrooms were damaged, so the local schools were using these gazebos as temporary classrooms. And during the pandemic, these gazebos became the platforms for public health programs, so for providing vaccine, educational, for exchange of ideas, or so different ministries have used this platform more than we thought. So landscapes aren't gonna solve the issues, but they are definitely providing a platform to mitigate the issues.
Yeah, that's in a way, landscapes have never been more important, right? As a place for people to meet and still make connections to each other. I have a question. Are those still ongoing? All of those programs and places still active today, as we've kind of taken our foot off the pedal of not seeing each other?
Yes, I mean, are you talking about the specific examples I shared?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so this program started in 2011, 2012, and the last
Oh,
time
wow.
we talked to the community, or sorry, worked with the community on site was in 2016. And since then, we have a bi-monthly meeting with them, or where they share some updates. And it was during 2020 that they call us and say like, hey, we're making this progress. Actually, they're working with other NGOs and with municipal services. The projects are still ongoing. We're not involved anymore. They have took ownership of the project, and they have found their own means to continue with these projects. The same with the public spaces in the communities in the Amazon rainforest, in the city of Iquitos. The communities are organized, they maintain and use the projects now. They're still using it right now. And this is kind of related to the participatory design approach. The government doesn't have a strong presence in these areas. The community design and build these spaces with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. So landscapes have been a means for people to engage and themselves get back to their communities. So let's move on to a few questions from our listeners. Angelique, can you explain more about the post-World War II Jewish landscapes and what led you to that particular research interest?
I grew up in a Black Jewish neighborhood in Philadelphia, so I was always around Jewish people and Jewish culture. So what I did was I took a lot of French in the Holocaust classes or film and Holocaust classes. I was always interested in how an atrocity happened and people began to recognize it and take initiatives to rectify a wrong. So I traveled a lot to Poland, Lithuania, France, visiting post-World War II landscapes, specifically Jewish cemeteries, and recognizing that a lot of the headstones and a lot of the burial sites were destroyed. And then after a few years or so, people came back and they started to say like, yeah, this was an issue, that we destroyed a sacred ground. And they've brought back some of the stones and brought back some of the respect to the people. And what was curious to me was that happened versus like in America and some places in South America, people still are not recognizing that there was big enslavement happening across the world, and there's no recognition of that. There's some monuments now, but it's still not enough. So what I took upon myself is to reach out and understand, specifically looking at the news and then seeing a lot of these Black cemeteries are found under gas stations, under roads, and seeing the neglect of it, I just didn't want to sit back and not do anything. I wanted to be an advocate, and I wanted to be a person that can save these sites and promote the connection to a history that has been or still is being erased.
So are you seeing interest in your work? In other words, is it moved from your research to action?
Yeah, and when I recently just got my master's in landscape architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington, and what I did was provide a maintenance plan for a Black cemetery called the Universe Cemetery in Tyler, Texas, and develop a way to keep the cemetery alive and to promote the idea that this is not a single occurrence. Like, this needs to be recognized and it can be replicated. The preservation of it can be replicated and it could get more people involved. So there's already a lot of groups doing that, like the Texas Freedom Colony by Dr. Andrea Roberts. There's a lot of people doing incredible work, and I'm just a small piece of it.
Yeah.
Hopefully make it something more.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that work. So Coco, a question for you. Do you see the profession having a greater role in mental health work, and how can we be leaders in that moving forward? Do we need to rethink how we design places and the impact that it has on people and especially children?
Yeah, I think in general, landscapes have a mental health impact most of the time for good, even if you design it without thinking about that. So what we are learning recently is that we can boost those benefits, So therapeutic gardens, healing gardens are fields that are developing, and we're learning technique and strategies for address specific issues. So one of my current projects right now is designing a senior facility in the city of Iquitos, and we're trying to address and design gardens for therapeutic reasons and for mental health, to address the mental health challenges of the patients. I think, like any other specialization, we're going to have to landscapes that want to address this, they have to follow those paths. And gladly, the body of literature is growing. The challenge becomes when you are want to jump into the public and work on public systems. We know a lot on the small scale, on the side scale, but there is a gap, I would say, when we're trying to boost this in city level. And that's part of where I'm working right now. It's to understand, for example, if you want to provide stipends and training for a whole city to develop gardens and public spaces, what things you need to consider, whether the challenges in education and economic aspects, who's going to pay for these improvements. So, so I would say in these aspects, I don't have an answer. We're still learning. In the small scale, we have, I think, a very strong foundation to address mental health and well-being.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to look at those smaller individualized projects. Michael Van Valkenburg, a long time ago, told me that if a landscape architect could really master all of the aspects of a garden that are important, so very small spaces, that they would understand how to translate that to much bigger spaces. So if you think about human comfort and safety and views and all of those things, you'd be able to translate. And it sounds like that's what you're saying as well.
Yeah, there's so many examples of landscapes that address that. I would recommend, if the person who is asking this question wants to focus on details of on site, there are so many guides. One that comes to my mind is Daniel's Winterbottom book, Therapeutic Gardens. Yep. I love that book. It's very well designed and written. So if you want to learn like specific details of what to think about to make place.
No, that's a great suggestion.
Good for mental health.
Thank you. And Bryce, so do you find that there's a difference in your approach, your design approach, between urban, suburban, or rural sites, or for that matter, sites that haven't been developed at all? Are there major differences in your approach? And if not, how and why?
I would say there are not major differences, and that it leans towards that initial approach where I first said, where we want to look at what would happen if we were to do nothing. That being said, I think in a rural context, Like right now, I'm looking out over a prairie. I'm in North Central Florida in Micanopy, and there's Lake Tuscaloosa, and the lilies are in bloom and the water is high. And so if we were to do nothing here, it would play out very differently than if you were to do nothing on, let's say, a corner block in Overtown, where there is a need for the ecosystem, which includes people, for food, but that would not grow otherwise. So I look forward to answering this question in posterity.
We'll look for it then.
Thank you.
This is a question for everybody. And Angelique, we're going to let you go first. We're going to go in alphabetical order. So how is the work of Olmsted relevant today? What should current students and emerging designers learn from Olmsted's work? And we're down to the single digits in our time left. So give us your brilliance in a few minutes.
I would say
Please.
be observant. Understand that you are not the only one interacting with this space. There's thousands or hundreds of people who are interacting with this space, and your point of view is unique. And you should be able to verbalize what you are seeing and what you're experiencing, because you never know who's going to have that same opinion or same interests.
And Bryce, how is the work of Olmsted relevant today? And what should current students and emerging designers learn from Olmsted's work?
Olmsted really looked at the landscape as a whole system. So that way of thinking is what makes you a landscape architect.
Thank you. And Coco, Olmsted still around, healthy, happy today in our work?
Yeah, and I agree with Angelique and Bryce, this vision of systems, and we're not the only users. I think the exercise of zooming in and zooming out when you're working on a site is something that we learn from Olmsted, and it's still valid and it's still necessary now. We're learning how to zoom out more and more to provide more benefits to the landscapes. That's a great lesson from those times.
Oh, thank you. And then this is also for everybody. Who are the figures in landscape architecture or elsewhere that inspire you the most in your work?
Oh man. I'll definitely say I ascribe to the lineage of Ian McHarg and Designing with Nature. I think he really laid out a methodology for putting into practice all these ideas that we were talking about. And I've never forgotten something that Nina Chase said. She said, "Don't give up on the land." We have a lot.
What does that mean to you? What does that mean?
She brought up these high-flying ideas of like these gardens in the sky, but she said, where you put your feet on the ground, that's the impact. That's where people live. That's this slice of the biosphere all around our planet where people are interacting. That is our livelihood, and that's where we have the place to make a change. And in terms of bringing up emergent landscape architects, exactly like I said, sometimes there's something in your mind that begs the question that is on other people's minds in the room, and by asking it, you're able to bring that to the forefront. And sometimes it takes that one person just to ask, what if?
I agree. Angelique?
I would say it's a mixture of what Bryce said, Ian McHarg, but also zooming into like my professors. They're big role models for me. Like at UTA, University of Texas at Arlington, Dr. Diane Jones-Allen and her husband, Austin Allen, and my professors at Penn State, Dan Marriott, Mark Miller. A lot of them have shaped who I am today. And I think that's important, is not only the people who laid the foundations, but the people who are still echoing the foundations and echoing the idea that landscape architecture is something that's ever changing and it's always something different.
Yeah, I'm really taken by your answer because, you know, since I've been practicing 40 years, there weren't a lot of landscape architects other than those that were so famous that people could point to. And now there's just such a huge constellation of leaders about the myriad of topics. So what do you think you learned most? Like, what's really stuck with you from the teachings of the leaders that you've mentioned?
Be patient, understand.
Oh
different
no, I'm
perspectives.
terrible at that. I'm terrible. You know, my mother told me the first characteristic she noticed in me was impatience, and it's just stuck with. So thank you for reminding me and us of that. Yeah, our profession takes patience.
Yeah.
And then, Coco, who are the figures in landscape architecture or elsewhere that inspire you the most?
I mean, for me, landscape architecture was a very interesting journey. My background is in architecture, so the people that I learned, from people that doesn't know anything about landscapes. They were just building the typical modern houses and very flat grass spaces. And it was my parents, both of them are MDs and epidemiologists, that were started asking me, so when you're designing, working the slums, because I was working on social projects already, so are you providing any benefits for health here? Are you, and eventually I started to discover, with these questions, that landscapes actually play a big role in built environment to provide health benefits. And one of my students in 2011, 2012, that now she's a professor at Penn State, Leanne Andrews, she's the one that realized, like, so have been designing gardens and parks for the last 3-4 years. So, you're basically a landscape architect in the closet. And she's the one that convinced me to go back to school and and join the master program at UW. So aside from this, I say a historic, a person I have really enjoyed reading was William Lyman Phillips. So actually he's, the father of tropical design, very well known in Florida. He was actually one of Olmsted's mentees. He worked in Panama during the yellow fever pandemic. And he had a very strong public health perspective for design. And he, one of his recommendations for landscape architects that I think is still valid today is, like, landscape architects working in these settings, they should be as rigorous as any other public health professional. I would say those figures are probably the most influential in my career.
That's so fantastic. And thank you for crossing the border and helping us think about these important issues. So with that, I see our time is almost over. And so Dee Dee, I'm going to turn it back to you. But first, let me thank all of our panelists. Really appreciate your thoughtful responses. And we look forward to hearing from all of you in the papers, as they say. So thanks very much. Dee Dee, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thanks to all of our participants. I agree, this has been a fascinating conversation. We're grateful to you for your insights, and we will look forward to seeing what you develop in the years ahead. As we heard from Bryce, posterity will let us know how you have done in this profession. And I will say, you've certainly, for me, provided a very compelling advertisement for pursuing a life in the field of landscape architecture. So thank you for that. And thank you to the Landscape Architecture Foundation for its Olmsted Scholars Scholars Program. We're very grateful. And I want to say to everyone else today, thank you for joining us. Please remember Olmsted 200 activities are in full swing and will run throughout 2022. We are posting new and diverse programs nearly every day, and the calendar on olmsted200.org is filled with activities. As I indicated early on, please watch your inbox to be able to register for the Olmsted's Conservation Legacy, September 9, and save the date now for our next conversation with Olmsted, September 20. This one will be entitled An International Perspective. We look forward to hearing from urban planner and landscape architect Kongzhen Yu, professor at Peking University and the founder of Tourinscape in Beijing, as well as Romy Heck-Marchand from Chile, who has just published Landscapes for the People, essays by Frederick Law Olmsted in Spanish. So please, again, check out the website. Our blog has some wonderful photos from our recent events in New York City and Chicago, including pictures of David Lee Sisko, the Chicago artist who created our memorable Olmsted head for the campaign. And our exhibit, Landscapes for the Public Good, is available and also available in Spanish. So until we meet again, celebrate Olmsted and happy Summer of Olmsted. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone.